That said, leading this will be Jason Rosenbaum from Action Network and Nate Thames from ActBlue. And I'll just pass it over to you guys.
Hello, everybody. My name is Jason Rosenbaum. I'm Director of Technology at Action Network. I'm happy to be giving this training here today. We hope to go through a few slides for you, answer some questions, and hopefully everybody will learn a little bit. Nate's going to start out with the slides, so I'm going to let him introduce himself while I get the slides set up here.
All right. This is Nate Thames. Like Brian said, I work at ActBlue. I lead our engineering efforts at ActBlue, so building the software that's behind ActBlue. Additionally, I have a further interest in security because I've worked for a long time consulting with journalists heading overseas to countries where they needed to be concerned about the security of their devices, and so advising journalists on how not to get hacked when they go to China or Russia, for example. So very excited to be here and excited to get started with the presentation.
All right, let's go. All right, everybody should be able to see my screen. Nate, go ahead.
All right, well, when I used to give these sorts of presentations, I used to have to first convince people why they should care about information security. And after this past election cycle, we don't need to do that quite as much. You know, there's this, it's right in front of our faces how important it is, not just for us personally, but really for us in terms of the missions that we all are striving to attain, and all of our supporters, the trust that they put in us. I think we all should feel that very seriously in terms of why we need to keep our data safe. The good place to start is, what are we protecting against? And it's good to know what your threats are before you know how you're going to protect against them. So first of all, we have what we like to term opportunistic drive-bys. So these threats are not necessarily targeted at your organization. They're not targeted at you personally. These are criminals who are just trying to break in and steal things, or break in just for the fun of it. So it's not targeted, and these attempts happen all the time. At ActBlue, we repel literally tens of thousands of these types of attacks every day. There are people that just go around the internet trying to break in things. And so it's important to keep that in mind as sort of like the lowest level of things you're trying to protect against. The second thing is cause-motivated amateurs. So the media has termed these hacktivists. And these are people who might be targeting your organization specifically because of the work that you're doing. Sometimes these are amateurs in that they are attacking your organization because they're part of Trump's army and they just want to make you put egg on your face. And sometimes these are groups of people who have self-organized, anonymous or what have you, who are working together in a slightly more sophisticated manner in order to do cause-motivated hacking. And then the third one that we often talk about, especially here at ActBlue, because of the work we do, are criminally motivated financial hackers. And these are hackers that are after usually credit card numbers or banking information. And this does happen in the political sphere. Just this last election cycle, the National Republican Senatorial campaign's web store was hacked, and tens of thousands of people who bought NRSC gear had their credit card stolen. And so it's something that even in politics and advocacy, we still need to pay close attention to. And then you're going to say, well, Nate, that's all nice and good, but this election cycle, it was all about the Russians, nation states, that were providing the real harm. And I will say that that's true. However, In many cases, for many of our organizations, the real threat are these other, sort of lower level threats. Hopefully few among us will be targeted by the Russians. And even if you are being targeted by a nation state, it's good to cover the low-hanging fruit first. So as Jason puts it, put it to me the other day, if Putin wants to get in, he'll get in. And part of our planning is figuring out how to limit the harm of something like that, and hardening where we can. So a good assumption to start with, and it's not a fun thing to assume, is that any of your written communications could be leaked. Whether it's hacking, whether it's a disgruntled insider, it's always good to keep in the back of your mind, should I be writing this down? Should I be putting this in a place that could eventually be stolen and put on the front page of the New York Times? Obviously, you're not always going to be able to avoid putting sensitive things down on paper, and we're going to talk about some things that you can do to mitigate that risk. But for example, if you were in an environmental group that was planning on breaking the law, and you might not want to write stuff like that down. You'd also probably want to talk to a lawyer first, but I'm not a lawyer, I'm not your lawyer, I'm not giving legal advice here. So first, let's talk about low-hanging fruit. And the reason why I like to start here is twofold. One is that most progressive organizations that I go into and I'm looking at, they all have easy things that can be fixed right away. The important thing to know here is even if, in the worst case scenario, you're being targeted by a nation state, that nation state is not going to want to burn one of their like James Bond-esque methods for getting information. They're going to try simple things first. So, the Russians didn't use lasers to hack John Podesta. They used spear phishing. They did the sort of attack that any 13-year-old in a basement could do, and it worked. And they didn't need to use some sort of super secret method of getting it. And so preventing these low-hanging fruit from biting you is an excellent place to start. And if you look at low-hanging fruit, you got to look at passwords. I feel just like this guy, where the amount of passwords I have to remember is too damn high. It really is true that for all the different services that we use, if you want to be secure, it can become a very big burden. And a good theme to keep in mind is if you can remember your password, it's probably a terrible password. It's the sad truth. A good password is like this one on the slide here. It's incomprehensible, it's unsensical, and it's long. And I'm not gonna memorize that. You're not gonna memorize that, and it's impossible to memorize separate passwords like that for all of your different services. So use a password manager. I don't know how many of you have heard of password managers. A lot of people use them now. I'm really impressed when I go into organizations and ask, how do you manage your passwords? And they're like, oh, we all use this password manager and we've all been trained on it. But I know there are people out there who haven't used password managers before. So for those of you who aren't aware, password managers generate these really terrible looking passwords for you, and then they remember them for you. And they have a browser extension so that you can automatically fill your password on websites. It remembers them, and it encrypts all of these passwords behind one big, strong master password. So instead of having to remember terrible passwords for every single service that you use a password for, you only have to remember one single terrible password. And I'm not good at remembering things, but after 20 minutes of practicing a 26-letter number and special character random password, I can remember it. I can do one. I can't do more than one. So password managers are great. If you don't currently use password managers in your organization or for your personal use, I mean, that's a huge bang for the buck. They all cost a little bit of money. I think it's money extremely well spent, and I would highly recommend it. I personally use 1Password, which works really great if you are a Mac shop. They have apps for your phone and on the computer, and it all seamlessly works really well together. But I also have people in my office that use KeePass and LastPass, and they also like those as well. I think the most important thing is to pick a system and stick with it and use it for every single password. So every single website that you use, that you log into, or application that you log into, should have a separate, unique, terrible looking password, and you should store them in your password manager. So after passwords, many websites will ask you, give us some secret, give us these answers to some secret questions. So if you ever get locked out, you can get back into your account. Now, you're never going to get locked out because you're using a password manager, which saves these passwords for you. And it turns out that these secret questions are actually a really great way to hack somebody's account. Because if you think about it, things like mother's maiden name, high school mascot, your first pet's name, and the make model of your first car, these are things that were written down somewhere. And in the age of the internet, and with a couple of phone calls, you can figure out these sorts of things about any person if they answer them truthfully. And so what I highly recommend is just fill in these secret question fields with gibberish. The one funny exception to this is when you have to call on the phone to, like, for Comcast, and they say, what's your secret question? And then you have to say, well, it's gibberish, and then they can authenticate you in a different manner. But in terms of the website, I always fill it completely with gibberish because I don't want it to be guessed, and secret questions are easily guessed. And then finally, one person should have one password to one service. I know it's very common in organizations as you're moving quickly and doing the important work that you do to share a password to some service. It's always a bad idea going forward for a couple of reasons. I mean, one reason is that if you have, if 15 people all have the same password to the service, what happens when one of them leaves? Then you have to do a new password and give it to everyone else. And what actually happens when someone leaves is that no one updates that password. And so people leave the organization, people go elsewhere, the same password is still in use. So it's important to use, whenever possible, make sure that each person who's using a service has their own login with their own password. And you will be happy that way. The next part of keeping safe and low-hanging fruit is using two-factor authentication. And I think we all know what this is now. Where when you log in, you get a text message with a code that you need to type in, or you have a little security dongle that has a code on it that you type in. These dramatically reduce your likelihood of getting hacked simply because in addition to stealing your username and password, an attacker also has to compromise the second factor, which is difficult to do. So if your provider offers two-factor authentication, definitely use it. I will say one thing though is that for your most sensitive services, I would try not to use text message two-factor authentication. There have been some attacks in the past where an attacker will first go after your phone account, and in some cases can convince the phone company to switch your number to the attacker's phone, and then the attacker can receive the text message as they're doing the attack. It's a little far-fetched, but it has happened, and for me personally, what I use is an app called Google Authenticator, and it allows you to generate these codes. And many of the services that do two-factor authentication, you can set up with Google Authenticator instead, and this generates the code on your actual phone. It's not being sent via text message, and so in that way, it is somewhat more secure. But even if you don't currently use two-factor authentication, getting text messages already makes you way more secure. So if that's the easiest way to have two-factor authentication, I wouldn't worry too much about it. In terms of what you should use two-factor authentication for, your email. We'll talk in just a second about how important email is, but set up two-factor authentication on your email, bar none, period. I consider there to be no good excuse for why you haven't set up two-factor authentication on your email. So that's that. Slack. also offers two-factor authentication. Also is where a bunch of really sensitive material ends up for organizations these days, and so definitely use and enforce two-factor authentication with Slack. Your sensitive applications, so this might be, for example, banking systems or what have you. A lot of these places do offer two-factor authentication now. And then social media, because while it's not the end of the world for someone to take over your Twitter account and post something embarrassing, it is embarrassing, and we'd all like to prevent that. And so, Twitter and Facebook, they all offer, Instagram, they all offer two-factor authentication. It's easy to set up, and you might as well start using it. So there you go. So let's talk specifically about securing your email, because email, honestly, is the skeleton key of your online identity. Just about every service that you ever sign up to allows you to reset your password via your email. And so a very common thing for an attacker to do is first attack your email, because if they get access to your email, then they can reset your password on Twitter and take over your Twitter account, and then they can reset your password with your bank, and then steal your banking information, and then they can reset your password. You see how this goes. And so the most important thing to secure in any organization is email. And so if you do one thing today, set up two-factor authentication for your email. Most of you probably use Gmail at this point, and set a good password for your email. That's bar none. If you do those two things, you will be more secure, first of all, than 98% of people out there. But also, you will have gone a long way to protecting your organization from all the ills that can happen when your email is compromised. So highly, highly, highly recommend that. And if you don't know how to do that, I would say just Google two-factor authentication, Gmail two-factor authentication, as funny as it sounds. And Gmail has a really good help section on how to set it up and what to do and things like that. Oh, another plug here. If you are setting up two-factor authentication, they will say, here, set up Google Authenticator, and you do that. And then they offer you a set of backup codes. It is nice, it is good to keep those backup codes, but it's also really important to keep those backup codes safe. What I recommend and what I do is I keep my backup codes in my password manager in a notes section, so that those backup codes are similarly encrypted, just like my username and my password. So it's an important thing to keep in mind, as those are very important to keep safe as well. So, all right, I think I've come to the end of the section of the slides that I'm doing. So if anyone has a specific question about things that I've just talked about, happy to take a short break here and take questions before Jason starts.
About 5 minutes before we're about at the halfway point here. So folks do have questions, you can type in the chat. There's a little icon that looks like a speech bubble. So if you want to go ahead and type, and Nate will answer. Nate, I can't actually see the chat myself with the screen up, so if you want to go ahead and answer questions.
All right, sounds good. So far, there are none.
Okay, well, we'll give people maybe another couple seconds.
Someone put in a link to tutorials for how to turn on two-factor authentication for basically every application on the internet, which is a great. Apparently, you can win free pizza there too. Who knew? That's worth following just for that. Well, if no one has questions about stuff like that, I think might as well go on and have Jason take it away.
Cool. All right, so we're going to get into kind of a little bit more of the active attack side of things. A lot of what Nate talked about is general great security practices and stuff that will kind of protect you if someone tries to attack you. I'm going to talk a little bit about what those attacks potentially could look like. And I think by far the most common is what is now called spear phishing. This used to just be called phishing. It's also called social engineering. You could just call it tricking people. So let's talk a little bit about that. And this kind of, the other title of the section could be how not to be John Podesta, right? How not to get your emails leaked a couple weeks before the election and potentially elect President Trump. So very important. So let's look at this scenario. You receive an email from your boss at 9 o'clock at night asking for your review of an attached online advertising budget for the next quarter. Maybe they've sent you an Excel spreadsheet or something like that. The email address is your boss's email. You look at that, you realize it's from them, and the signature line in the email is correct. It's the one your boss uses, so there's nothing really suspicious and red flaggy about that. But in reality, the email didn't actually come from your boss. Someone's faked that, and they're trying to trick you. And this doesn't take a lot of technical knowledge or really technical ability to do. It's more in the technique than it is in the actual kind of hacking part, right? It's very easy to send email that looks like it's from other people. In fact, in Action Network, we're in the business of sending a lot of email. That's essentially how our system works, right? We allow you to type in any from line and any reply to when you're setting up your mass email, and we're essentially spoofing you when we send those emails, sending email as you. So it's actually quite easy for someone to send you an email that looks like it's from someone else. It requires almost no technical skill. And they're just trying to trick you here. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to trick you into giving up some sensitive information. So in this example, they're trying to trick you into opening that attachment. And so really, one rule of thumb is never open email attachments. They're a huge vector for hacking, and usually this is more of the drive-by scenario that Nate had talked about. You know, they're going to install some kind of malware on your system, a virus or some kind of program that maybe will watch your keystrokes to try to steal your passwords or look for banking information on your system and send it back to the attacker. And these, you know, these are in kind of these attachments. Often they're Microsoft Word documents or Excel documents, that kind of thing, that can have viruses embedded in them. So to the best of your ability, never open email attachments. Certainly never open them if you're not expecting the attachment to come to you. And definitely never open it if it's from someone you don't know. To the extent you can, use other ways to share files, right? Have your boss share a Google Doc or something like that as opposed to sending you an attachment. So be very, very wary about email attachments. Next is check URL. So this is another way that folks can trick you into getting what you want. You know, maybe they're going to send you an email that looks like it's from Google saying reset your password, and they'll say click here to reset your password. And when you click that button, you're going to get a URL that looks like this: password reset for gmail.google.com.frdews.ru. Right? So it looks like it's a Google address until you kind of get to the end and realize that this is not Google at all. This is Vladimir Putin trying to steal your password. So they're trying to trick you by leading you to a site, and it's going to look exactly like Gmail's password reset page. You won't be able to tell the difference, but you can look at the URL and realize it's not google.com. And so if you had typed in your email address and password into that page, you would have sent those credentials directly to whoever was trying to attack you. So be very careful. Check those URLs. This is especially sometimes hard to do on mobile. So be very careful about clicking links in email, and especially entering sensitive data. Make sure you're checking those passwords. And next up, just kind of generally be paranoid. So it's, you know, if your boss sends you that email and it's something you're not expecting, pick up the phone and call them and make sure that that email was legitimate. Ping them on Slack, you know, whatever it is. Be paranoid about the email that you're receiving, and really just confirm that you know, things are legitimate in ways that are harder to spoof. You know, phone calls, I think, are really great for this. And I think this is probably the most important one there. You know, I mean, we receive all kinds of, or at least I personally receive all kinds of these things. They usually end up in my junk folder, but you know, fake password reset forms and you know, fake forms about I need to update my information because my bank lost something or whatever it is. All of that is usually wrong. When in doubt, confirm with, you know, your bank or the service or your boss or whoever it is. Make sure that they're actually sending you what they thought they did. The next thing I want to talk a little bit about is protecting your browser. So your browser is really your window to the web, and you know, that's kind of what we use to do basically all of our work. There's certainly some things we do in apps and things like that, but really so much of people's lives is spent in the browser that making sure you're protecting that browser and it's kind of like a single point of failure. If someone can compromise your browser and get in, they're able to really they're going to be able to get a lot from you, right? They're going to be able to see everything you type into websites. They're going to be able to get into your computer. So really, you're going to want to secure that browser. So the first thing you do is use an up-to-date browser, and really we recommend an up-to-date version of Google's Chrome browser. There are a lot of browsers out there, but Google has the best security track record. They've got a team of security researchers who work on keeping Chrome secure. They also update their browser very often, which is very important. Often these things move very quickly. A vulnerability will be found in a browser, and it will be disclosed publicly, or it will be kind of active in the wild, hackers taking advantage of it, and there'll be kind of a race there for the people who make the browsers to update their browser and fix that bug. And then protect everybody from that. And this could be a matter of days, or even hours, or maybe weeks. So some browsers just don't get updated as often, which means that those bugs hang out there for longer, and you're vulnerable for longer. Microsoft, Safari, all of those browsers don't get updated nearly as often as something like Chrome. I think Firefox is a reasonable choice as well. They update fairly often also, but we definitely recommend Chrome. Beyond that, turn off all browser plugins, especially Flash. Flash is old, it is buggy, and as this graphic shows here, essentially every day there's like a new bug in Flash. So you have to just constantly update it to be safe, and honestly, it's just really not safe. It already basically doesn't work on phones. It certainly doesn't work on iOS, and I don't think it works too well on Android anyway. So just get rid of Flash. And already a lot of browsers like Chrome won't play Flash by default. You have to kind of click to play it. So it's already kind of being blocked. You don't really need it for much. I'd say get rid of it if you can. It's a huge security hole. Probably the #1 way that browsers are compromised are through Flash. Next one might be a little bit harder, and that's turn off all those browser extensions, or at least any of the ones you can. And the reason is browser extensions are certainly useful, right? They do a lot of useful things. Things like 1Password that Nate mentioned, some of those are browser extensions. But turn off all the ones you can and try to get that number, down to 0. And the reason is that browser extensions are little bits of code that run in a very privileged position in the browser. Essentially, browser extensions, if they want, they can read all your keystrokes. They can see every web page that you're visiting. They can modify the page as it's being transmitted, so they could insert some malicious stuff in there if they wanted to. So they run in a very privileged position, and it's hard to tell if you can trust them or not just by downloading an extension from the web store. And it's also possible, and this has happened, for browsers to be compromised or for extensions to be compromised after the fact. So maybe you've downloaded a legitimate extension from a legitimate company, and then a hacker gets control of the account of that company that controls the code behind that extension. And that hacker is able to put up new code that maybe keeps the extension working as you expected, but surreptitiously, very secretively starts stealing some of your data. And browser extensions usually update automatically. You're usually not doing code reviews on these extensions to make sure nothing has changed that you don't want to change. So that code can kind of sneak in there without you realizing it, and popular extensions have been compromised this way. So to the extent you can, turn off all those extensions. At the very least, make sure you're periodically reviewing those extensions. Once a month, go through your list of active extensions and turn off the ones you don't need anymore. You're always going to find a few that maybe you installed to try out and you no longer really use. Definitely turn off the ones that you don't need. At the very least. But I would say try to get that number as close to 0 as you can, except for maybe a few, like your password manager, and also maybe like an ad blocker. There are a lot of ad blocker extensions out there. uBlock Origin's a good one, but there are definitely a bunch of others. And I would say installing a good ad blocker does a few things. One, it's going to make your web browsing experience a lot faster because you're not downloading ads. The second is it's going to block off a really common vector for drive-by browser compromisers, which is advertisements. Hackers will place ads with web publishers, and they don't realize that those ads are actually serving malware and viruses to people who view the ads. And blockers are also going to block all kinds of tracking and kind of malicious JavaScript, and there's all kinds of things in there. So use a good ad blocker. uBlock Origin's a nice one to try, but keep that extension list small, except for just a few things. So the last thing I wanted to talk about here is just a little bit about what vendors do. So that's folks like me and Nate, as opposed to kind of you protecting yourself, what we're doing to try to keep your data secure. So I'm going to talk about a few things, then I'll turn it back over to Nate and see if he has anything to add. But we kind of sit in a different position than you all. So you all are protecting your organization, you're protecting your accounts, so things are focused on two-factor authentication and securing your email and your browser and stuff like that. We serve as a repository for some of your data, and so we're trying to protect that. So our threat model is different. The people who are trying to attack us, the kind of ways that they do it are different. So we're doing a few things. So one is we're using HTTPS everywhere. So this is making sure that the connection between you and us when you go to load our web page is encrypted. So if someone is sitting in the middle between us, so maybe they've hacked into your Wi-Fi and they're on your network and they're looking at the web traffic that you're sending, if someone's sitting there, they won't be able to see what you're sending to us and vice versa. So if you type in your password, that person, that man in the middle there, won't be able to see what that password is. They won't be able to see our communication. So both ActBlue and Action Network use this type of encryption everywhere, so your connection between us and you is secure. Two-factor authentication, we offer that as a feature, so you can turn that on in your account. In Action Network, at least, you can edit your profile and turn it on there. And it uses Google Authenticator, as Nate mentioned, or those other types of apps. So we offer that as a feature to allow you to lock down your account. So I would say, in this day and age, for important accounts, things like banking information and potentially things like Action Network, where you're storing your list of members and stuff like that, I'm not sure I would use a service that doesn't offer two-factor, right? I certainly wouldn't use an email service that doesn't offer two-factor. And for certain sensitive applications, that may be a thing you need to kind of put on your list as you're checking the boxes to figure out if you want to use a service or not. The other thing that we do is kind of just general industry standard encryption and best practices on our coding work. So when we're making new features, when we're coding stuff up, we are making sure to follow these best practices. That means keeping libraries. They're kind of these big repositories of code, shared code that we use, that other people use as well, keeping those up to date. So if there's ever a bug that's discovered in one of those are patched quickly. It means various industry standard practices and protections, various services that we use to detect intrusions, all different kinds of things. Penetration testing that we all might use, which is where we hire people to actually try to break into our systems to see if it can be done and to help point out security holes. So there's all these kinds of best practices and industry standards that we're using. We're keeping up on security announcements. We're making those patches and making changes. So that's just kind of our general work that we're doing, but really does help lock down data and make sure things nobody can access what they shouldn't be able to access. And then the last one is we try to minimize the attack surface wherever we can. And I think here this is one where maybe there's a little bit of a difference between us and ActBlue. On our system you can raise money. You can enter credit card information and people can donate to you, but we actually never touch those credit card numbers. We send those numbers directly to our payment processor, whose name is WePay, or we actually work with ActBlue with an API connection. But those credit card numbers never hit our servers, which means that if, and hopefully this would never happen, but if someone does break into our system, there are no credit card numbers to steal. So we're trying to minimize our attack surface as much as possible, and I'm sure ActBlue does similar things, though they obviously do deal with this sensitive information. So let me turn it over to Nate just for a minute or two and talk about the things that ActBlue does to keep their data safe.
Sure, thanks, Jason. So as Jason mentioned, one of the reasons that I'm interested in security is that since ActBlue was founded, security has been sort of at the core of what we do, simply because we handle the thing that every criminal on the internet would love to get their hands on, which are credit card numbers and other personal personally identifying information, known in the industry as PII. And it's something that we take incredibly seriously. So as Jason mentioned, one of the tactics that we use very successfully is minimizing attack surface. So the actual application that anyone ever interacts with and sees as ActBlue doesn't actually have any credit card numbers in it. We actually have a separate service that has a very small code base and has very locked down controls that actually holds the physical credit card numbers. Funny story, in order for that application to actually access credit card numbers, those numbers have to be decrypted, because obviously when they are being just held and not being used, they're encrypted so that no one can read them. But to decrypt them, we don't want any single person in ActBlue's organization to be able to decrypt a credit card. And so we actually use an encryption algorithm that allows us to have a sharded encryption key. And so various members of ActBlue have pieces of this encryption key and keep them private. And then we can combine them in order to, our powers combined, allow the application server to reboot. So in effect, what that means is if that server has trouble in the middle of the night, I have to wake up like 6 people in order to put the encryption key back together in order to get the server restarted. But it's worth it for the security purposes. And we don't get woken up very often, so that's good too. The other thing that we've done that has really provided, I think, an enormous amount of benefit for very low cost is we have a bug bounty. So if you go to the security section of the ActBlue website, you'll see that we encourage people to report security concerns to us. And if someone reports something that we feel rises to a level of concern that we need to fix, we will pay that person for finding that and reporting it. And it turns out that there are people on the internet who do nothing else other than try and find flaws in companies that have bug bounties so they can collect the money. And so when we started this bug bounty program, we had hundreds of people, mostly from the third world, honestly, trying to attack our servers 24/7, trying to figure out different things. And no one found anything serious, but there were quite a few little things that could have made attacks worse had there been an initial intrusion, and a lot of tightening here and there that we could do. And these penetration testers looking for those bug bounties found them. And so my takeaway from that experience is that any organization that doesn't offer a bug bounty program has these bugs in their system, and they just don't know about it. And so I highly recommend to organizations to either do official penetration testing, which we also do because we're PCI certified. So we have real, very expensive penetration testers every year that attack our systems to ensure their safety. But we also run this bug bounty program, which is sort of like a crowdsourced penetration test, and we've gotten really great results from that as well. So I think that's a really key thing for us. I think that wraps it up. I know both Jason and I would love to answer questions if anyone has any questions, either about security things in general or security things, very specific things. We'd love to answer them. So looks like we have a question from Terry, and it may be better for Jason to answer this. Terry asks, can you talk about logging in through Facebook, for example? Action Network offers this option at login, correct?
Yeah, that's right. So we do. So you can log in through Facebook or Twitter. That's one way to make your account. And if you do that, we're essentially, so it's a system called OAuth. That is how those logins happen. It is a cryptographic system that essentially exchanges information between us and Facebook. So we go and ask Facebook, does this key that we've been given when you set up that account match this person? And are they currently logged into Facebook? Should we treat them as essentially we're relying on Facebook for that authentication. Should we treat them as logged in? And if Facebook says, yep, they're good to go, then we'll log you into your account, and we're kind of relying on that Facebook account. So in terms of security, I think that is no more or less secure than any other method. I think the key thing to remember then is that if you are logging in that way, that Facebook is now the account that you need to secure, right? So Facebook offers two-factor authentication. So if you're logging into Action Network, you can't use our two-factor authentication because you're logging in through Facebook, but you should use Facebook's two-factor authentication. So somewhere down the chain, that account is secure. So I would say those kinds of things are fine. I tend to not like them because it's harder for me to remember what I logged in from. If I'm using that password manager, that's just kind of going to autofill my login whenever I get to the browser page. So it's very easy for me to log in and use a regular account. Some people like to log in that way. I don't think it's any more or less secure. You just have to realize that you're relying now on that other service. And so you want to make sure that that account is locked down, because if they can get into your Facebook account and you've logged into Action Network with Facebook, then they can also get into your Action Network account.
Anybody else have a question? While we're waiting, a question I often get is, well, Nate, you tell me to use this password manager, but aren't you telling me to put all of my really secret, important passwords all in one place where an attacker could, if they got into my password manager, it would be a disaster? And my answer to that is true. However, the benefits that you get from having a completely random scrambled password for every single thing that you log into well outweighs any potential risk from having all of your passwords in one place. And you also have to remember that the passwords in your password manager are protected by encryption, and a password manager's safety depends on the veracity of that encryption, and good password managers often have open source or third-party audited code so that you know that they're implementing the encryption properly. And it also depends on you picking a really good master password. And so the key to picking a great master password for your password manager is, first of all, it needs to be a password that you've never used before and you will never use again on any other service. It needs to be unique. I personally feel like it should be non-dictionary, non-word. I like a minimum of 20 characters, more if you are feeling ambitious. And the key is to never put that password anywhere, ever. It should never be written down. You should never type it into any other program on your computer. And if you ever accidentally do, and I've seen this, I've seen people accidentally type their passwords into a Slack window because that was the window that was in front of the other window and they didn't realize it. If you do that, you need to immediately change your master password and never use it again. And so that's key. Terry has another question. It's a good one. How often should you change that master password? Says Terry, talking about the password manager. I believe that as long as you trust the veracity of the encryption that the password manager has, and you also trust that you picked a good, unique master password that has never been used anywhere else and has never been written down anywhere, I don't believe you need to rotate the master password. And the reason why I say that is that I can't see how having the same master password for a long period of time would be any sort of risk. And I can see how if you were forced to rotate that master password every once in a while, it might encourage you to make a master password that was easier to remember and therefore a weaker password. So I personally, I have not rotated my master password in years, and it is a horrifically complicated, line of gibberish that I just sat down and memorized one afternoon. And I don't want to do that again. And so as long as I manage to not write that master password down anywhere else, I feel like I'm safe keeping that for a long time.
And I agree. I think there's a lot of things, they're called some people will call them anti-patterns, right? They're things that seem smart and seem like good practice, but actually make things weaker. And I think a lot of stuff around passwords that some organizations and applications insist on are actually anti-patterns. I think rotating passwords often is one of those, because if you need to memorize a new password every time, you're going to be encouraged to do something weaker, right? Just add a 1 or a 2 or a 3 at the end or something like that, or make it shorter and easier to remember. And all of that is going to make your password weaker. Similarly, things go for services that have requirements about what kind of characters need to go in passwords, right? It needs to have an uppercase letter. It needs to have a number. That's just kind of giving a guide to the hacker about what passwords they can expect people to use. I would say the only thing to enforce if you're doing passwords is length. That's really the only thing that matters. Longer is stronger, but beyond that, all that other stuff is actually, making things weaker.
Totally agree. Anyone else have questions? I'll give you a minute. I'll answer another common question that I get when I do these in person. People often ask, well, Nate, what you say is all fine and good, but in the real world, in a fast-moving organization, sometimes we do have to share a password. It happens, and we know we shouldn't happen, and we'll cross ourselves and say Hail Marys after doing it. But how can you actually share a password safely? And I would say, first of all, it's a bad idea. But second of all, if you do have to do it, the best way to share a password is to, in my opinion, and some may disagree, is to use a password manager that allows you to share vaults. And so 1Password, which is a password manager that I use, allows you to share a password vault, which is a collection of passwords behind a master password, with other people. And so you can have they have a whole online system that you can pay a subscription fee for, or you can do it manually through Dropbox or something like that. But you can share passwords that way, and I think that as long as you trust your password manager, which I think you kind of have to, that's a reasonable way of sharing a password. The other way to share a password that is less great, but it's a lot better than putting a password clean text in an email or in an instant message or in a Slack direct message. Never do that, by the way, because then that password is written down on the internet forever. The other way is to use a service like onetimesecret.com. And the trick with OneTimeSecret is that you shouldn't trust OneTimeSecret either. For all you know, they're the Russians. But as long as you do not put information in the OneTimeSecret that allows someone with that information to know what that information pertains to, I feel like it is less of a risk than putting that password in plain text in Slack or email or whatever else. Another perfectly good option is to call the person and read it out over the phone. If your threat model includes seriously the NSA, and for almost everyone it shouldn't, maybe you wouldn't want to do that. But I'd argue that if your threat model includes the NSA, then you should not be sharing passwords to begin with. So shouldn't be a problem. Neil has a question. Neil asks, are there any affordable options for penetration testers? It's a great question. Unfortunately, for the most part, professional security folks these days tend to be very expensive. It's kind of the Wild West, and obviously every time there's a big intrusion, whether in the commercial world or in the political world, all of these guys, increase their prices by 30% and can get it. I think in many cases you get what you pay for. The people who are really good at this can command high salaries and therefore contract out at hourly rates that can seem, positively eye-watering. I feel like for a small organization, you probably aren't going to want to drop $50,000 on a pen test, and it's probably not a good use of your organization's resources to do that. But I do think that bug bounties are a good middle ground for small organizations, like on your contact page saying, if you have a security concern and responsibly report it. we will, consider giving you a bounty for what you found. That's a certainly not as good as an official pen test, but somewhat of a middle ground. Jason, do you have an opinion on affordable options?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're generally right that you get what you pay for. I think there's a few other things to mention. One is if you're talking about penetration testing of software, there are a few automated pen testing things out there. We actually use one that we like. We don't think that it's a substitute for a determined penetration tester that is a person, but it is good at uncovering software vulnerabilities that you might not otherwise see. It's called Detectify, but there's a few others out there. So I'd say, in a pinch and for, understanding the limitations, those are useful. So you can try some of those automated systems. I think the other one to say is that if you're talking more about like, how can I test if my organization is ready for something like spear phishing, you can kind of run it yourself against your own organization. Right? You can try to phish your fellow colleagues by sending them spoofed emails and things like that. And there's some guides out there on the internet about how to kind of run these kinds of things. But you could run a test on your organization to see if people are going to fall for the fake password reset email or whatever it is, and then you can present those results back to your colleagues and talk about how you can harden that security, and you can kind of do that on a regular basis and make it an exercise that your organization goes through. And I think that's something that's, it'll take some planning on your part, but I don't think it's very expensive, and, you'd be surprised how many people fall for it every time. So, I think it's potentially an important exercise for you to run.
Totally agree. That's a really good point. I think Jason's distinction is important. For most normal advocacy organizations, you probably don't need a professional pen tester simply because you probably aren't writing software and hosting software of your own. Honestly, this is, again, a personal opinion, and people will disagree, but I strongly, strongly recommend that unless your organization's core competency is hosting and securing software, do not host your own software. Don't run your own WordPress server. Don't run SIFI CRM on your own server. Don't do that, because unless you have staff whose full-time job it is to monitor these software suites for security vulnerabilities and update underlying packages and monitor firewall logs, that's always going to be a weak point in your organization. And so I say happily outsource those sorts of things to companies that do it as their full-time thing. And focus on securing your softer assets, such as your email and things like that. So just like most organizations today wouldn't run their own email server, I also think we're now at a point where most organizations probably should not be running their own, CRM server or their own whatever server, unless that's like a core competency of your organization. In which case, then you probably should be dropping the real money on penetration testers, and you should probably also have a security team on staff.
All right, we've got maybe 2 more minutes here. So if folks do have another question, we maybe have time for one more. And if not, that's fine too. It was really good talking with you all. Hopefully you got something out of this, something you're able to bring back to your organization, have some conversations, sometimes tough conversations about, spending some time or spending some money, securing stuff like this. It's always better safe than sorry with this. You don't want to look back 6 months from now or a year from now and kind of kick yourself that you didn't take the time or the effort to implement some of these things. So I would recommend, if you do one thing today, put two-factor on all of your emails. And if you do too, really schedule some time with you and your colleagues to talk about some of these issues and put in place a plan to hopefully better secure your organization.
And if you do 3, start using a password manager.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you, folks, for joining. Mari, Brian, I don't know if there's anything else to say here.
No, we recorded this, and so we'll be sending out a follow-up email with the recording if you want to share with your colleagues. But otherwise, thanks everyone for joining. Like Brian said at the beginning, this is a part of a series of webinars that we're hosting for our partners, and we're really thankful to ActBlue for joining us today.
Thanks, folks.
Super glad I could be a part of it. Thanks for having me.